Hey, Bunny Buddies! Welcome to episode 3 of this drawing session series. It is an uncut, unedited example of how I work on commissions. This is still Chad's commission. I am working on the flat colors this time of that third pose on the right. I am showing you that I moved the line art a little bit to the right so that I'd have more room for stuff later on. I have it on a separate layer because the more a picture becomes complicated, you want to keep creating new layers so it's easier to keep track of things and keep them safe. I showed you in the last episode how I did the line art for this, and now you're going to see that I added a flat color of gray behind the line art. It's on the bottom layer. It was white beforehand, but now I've moved it to a gray because a different shade of color helps the future colors show up better. As you can see right there. Because to me, white is a little harsh. It's a little hard to see all these colors against it. And here I am taking all the colors and putting them on my color palette. Every digital art program has a color palette. Sometimes you have to do a little bit of Googling to find out where your program has it. But for Medibang that I'm using here, because it's free, I have it over on the left under my color picker. So here I'm putting all of the colors like the hair, the fur, the eyes, the nose, and now moving over to this third pose. I'm going to pick the color, I'm going to double check my brush size and make sure it's the right thickness. I'll do a little test just to make sure that the pressure sensitivity is working. And then on the layer underneath the line art, I begin. And good thing you'll see here is that I keep it loose. I don't really fret about being perfect right off the bat. I want it to be efficient, and I don't really worry about perfection on the first try. For me, I can be a bit impatient and have to really keep track of my time when I'm drawing, so I tend to feel a lot better when I've gotten a lot of marks on the paper. I don't know about you, but whenever I see an empty page, it's really intimidating. So for me, I really try to get as much done on the page so that I feel productive. I've seen a lot achieved. And then I can go back and clean up later. So as you can see here, I'm just trying to quickly fill in all of the spots. Occasionally I go outside the lines, and for me that's not a problem. I'll just clean it up later. I feel more confident when I've filled in a lot of work so that I know I've gotten something done. And as you can see, I'm slowly filling in the entire character one color. This is because of a trick I use with the selection brush that I've seen many artists do. I didn't always do this the first few years of digital art, but now I've learned it's a really efficient way to color. I am filling in the entire character with one color only, and once that's done, I can then use a selection tool and make the entire thing locked so that I never color outside this area. It's really useful for saving time. Before, I used to just pain myself to always color inside the lines, and every time I put down a new color, it got more and more tricky, it got messier. So this is an easy way to save time, is just use one color. That makes it simple. Fill in the entire character. You don't have to be perfect, you can clean it up later. But I just put in all the colors, staying relatively within the lines, and then through various methods you can select this color, and then it will all of your future marks will stay within that color. For me in Medibang, there's a button near the layers that's I think called Lock Alpha, or something to that extent. It locks the main color. Everything that I've been putting onto this layer, it locks that in place. And then any future marks I make are only where I have made previous marks, as you'll see in a little bit. With Photoshop, the version I had previously, it had something called lock transparent pixels, which just means it was preventing me from making new marks in the transparent areas, the empty spots. Every program's got a slightly different way of saying it, but basically it's a selection thing near your layers that prevents you from making marks outside the areas you've drawn. You can also use a selection brush or the magic wand, which will just, you click the color and it will automatically select everything touching that color, which is also very useful. So yeah, whichever selection method you want to use, once you've put in a silhouette of color like this, you can loosely clean it up, but don't fret about it. Don't worry about it being perfect. Right now, I still have little tiny mistakes outside the lines. If I notice them, I clean them up, but it's actually okay to just keep it loose, because you don't want to stress. Stress is your enemy. You'll get depressed, you'll get intimidated by it, and we're trying to keep this easy. So once I put in all the colors, I've locked the layer, I've locked the alpha, as it were, in this program, and now I'm going to start coloring the actual patterns. And I use the colors that I chose earlier on my color palette, and so now it's easy to get those colors over there on the left whenever I need them. Putting in the marks of the character's face first, because I tend to think starting with the face is easier, because when you want to show progress to somebody, if you run out of time, but you've at least done the face really well, that is usually the first place someone wants to look. I don't know about you, but a lot of people tend to look at the face of a character when you're looking at any kind of picture. You know, we relate to characters, whatever species or creature they are, even just normal people or animals. We look at the face because we relate to them. We want to see what the mood is. Are they happy? Are they sad? Are they angry? What's going on? Where are they looking? So I always start with the face, because then at least I know my audience is going to look straight at the face when they look at the picture. And if I've already done that, it feels good. They already are like, oh, okay, he got the face done. And it's hard to explain, but it's like a psychological trick of, oh, okay, good, they've got that part. So it's a little more satisfying. And it feels it to me, because then I can look at the face and go, okay, I'm on the right track. If I keep along this pattern, it will look well. It'll look good. Words. I did the hair, and again, notice along the hair, there are little empty spots, little tiny mistakes on actually all of these, because I'll be doing cleanup after I've done all these flat colors. A good chunk of my time when working on a commission is all the cleanup, because there's always a little bit that you've missed, and that's normal. Again, I like to focus on getting a lot of progress visible, because if you focus on one tiny area and really dwell on getting it perfect, that tiny area might be perfect at the end, but then when you zoom out and say, okay, what have I gotten done today? And you see only a tiny area that looks good, and the whole rest of the character has been untouched, it feels a little intimidating. You know, it's like, oh, really? I still have all of the rest of him to do? Man, I'm not making any progress. So instead, I like to jump around and put a little bit everywhere. And here I'm working on the eyes. And just, it keeps me in a productive mood. By the way, notice that the eyeballs are not true white. I did a kind of grayish blue. And that's because contrast makes the white shine pop out. The little white circle in the eye, it makes it pop if I have darker colors underneath it. That's why I put a dark green underneath that white shine. It helps the green look shiny, and it makes that little white circle look extra bright. So I think a general rule, if you want to make your eyeballs of your character look a little more real, don't make it true white. Add a grayed blue, a muted blue. Muted just means it's got gray in the color. So it's not a bold color on your color palette, color picker. It has some gray in it. A lot of my colors tend to be in the middle of the color picker where there's a bit of gray because it helps the color look soft. And then if I want something to pop, like those eyes, then I make them bold. Another word for bold is saturated. So if you ever hear that word and you think that sounds way too fancy, don't worry. Saturated just means bold. It means you're on the far right of that color picker in the corner. That's all it means. Saturated means bold. And it can add a really bright effect, but it can also be a bit unrealistic. So if you're wanting something to be soft and muted, you add the gray. You go in towards that middle area. So I'm drawing the fur there. I'm coloring the fur on the back of his neck, that brown color. And now I'm moving on to his vest, which is a muted blue. Because if you think of a lot of blue jeans, and this vest is of a blue jean material, it's always that kind of soft, muted gray. It looks all faded. Little changes like that, instead of just doing, oh, I'll just do any blue or a sky blue, it may become too intense and not quite what you were going for. So little changes like that can make a big impact on the whole look of that object, like the vest. And I'm making sure to strictly follow all of the lines that I've previously drawn. That's a big thing when it comes to flat colors of line art. You need to follow those lines. Don't go outside the lines. Make sure that the direction you're coloring is, like all those marks you're making, make sure they're in the direction of the line art. This is even true with traditional art. I did coloring with pencils on paper for years before I finally got a tablet, so these apply to traditional art as well. A lot of what I'm saying can loosely go straight over to your traditional art. I'm about to do the t-shirt, which is black, but notice that I'm not going true black. I'm keeping it in the lower left of the color picker, like I'm going to show with my mouse right there. It's in the lower left corner, but it's not completely black. I'm going down in that corner, but keeping it a little bit above. When it is a dark gray, it helps the line art still show up. And by contrast, next to all these other colors, it still looks black, but you can still see the line art, which is a very useful technique. Let's see, I'm doing the marks along the t-shirt, along the edges of the other objects, and notice that I'm not strictly worried if I go outside the lines. You know, if I make a mark that occasionally bleeds over, it's easy to fix, whether I do it at that moment or I do it afterward in cleanup. The end goal should follow all of your line art. That's what I meant by strictly follow them. But in the moment, it's okay if you leave little mistakes here and there. You can always go back and clean them up later. I think that's kind of one of my biggest tendencies, is to make sure that I keep moving forward. Because if I have a time limit, I really don't have enough time to dwell on every tiny mistake at first. I have to keep my flow going. Keep moving forward. And like you see right here, I'm now adding a tiny bit of shading. And when it comes to shading, I tend to think shadows need to be a little bit more saturated as you get darker. Because if you just add black to make a shadow, it can make the object feel a little dull. Instead, when I add my shadows onto the object, I slowly make the darker parts more and more saturated. Whereas if you get lighter and lighter, you're adding little bits of bright light and highlights on this object, then I get more and more towards the white, a little more muted. But see, as I am putting on those buttons and adding in shading in a second, you'll notice that my shadows get more saturated and my highlights are closer to the white. So I'm putting in some highlights on the shoulder, see? And that lighter blue is closer to the white. It's closer to the muted side. Whereas when I add a shadow, I'm going to be getting more saturated. I'm going to get bold. So I can understand how some people like to just, when it needs to be light, you add white. And then when you need to make a color darker, you add black. But that is not going to create a very lively effect. If you want there to be more life in your colors and to make your objects feel brighter and feel more alive and easier to look at, play around with the saturation and mutedness of your colors. And notice that I'm not doing any gradients. I'm doing flat colors, even with those highlights where the shadows are and all that stuff. It's flat, but when I make the right shape and pay attention to where I put it, it looks like I'm adding a 3D shape. I'm paying close attention to those folds, all those lines I've drawn. For the folds in the jacket, I'm closely following those lines. Excuse me. And because the edge of that jacket is pointing away from his torso, I'm adding the brightest highlight there because it's in the light. Whereas the vest, the part of the vest that's getting closer to his armpit or behind him, that part is getting much darker. And here I'm adding a shadow on the button. And again, notice that I made the shadow color, that dark brown, much more bold. It's closer to the right of that color palette. And then when I add the shine, I go to the left, the upper near the white. And notice all I'm having to do is just add a little bit of white in that top corner of the button. And then opposite of it, I'm doing a curved brown that I carve into a round shape, and it makes the button pop. It's not much effort, but it instantly gives you a result. And had to erase a tiny bit of messy line art there, which again, that's my point. You don't have to be perfect on the first try. You can clean up like I literally just did. Carving away those colors. As you've already guessed by now, I love to carve all my coloring and my line art. It's just the technique that I'm really fond of using. Some people can be, they can be more comfortable when they're making the lines perfect on the first try, so they don't have to go back later. That can work, and if it feels comfortable to you, obviously go ahead and do it. But for me, I suggest following your flow and go back later. Clean it up later. Instead, worry about getting a little bit of progress everywhere so that you can look back and go, wow, I've gotten a lot done. It's easier to show progress that way too. If you have a time limit, you have to show someone your progress. Look, I've gotten all this done in, maybe wasn't even 20 minutes because I was worried about putting a little bit all over as opposed to perfection. Because you can come back later. Don't worry. I'm not trying to talk down to you. I apologize if I get in the mood of teaching and occasionally I'm overemphasizing things. Sometimes I'm trying to figure out the tone I need to deliver all this advice because I'm trying to give you the best advice that I can and all the stuff that I've learned. But at the same time, I want to make sure this is really easy to understand. And so occasionally I'm having to overemphasize something and repeat myself, and it's I just want to make sure you hear me say it and it's not confusing. I apologize if sometimes it's we get it, move on. I apologize if I repeat myself too much. I just really want you to notice what I'm doing so that you can use it. Because that's the thing I've always wanted when it comes to listening to tutorials. I've been listening to a lot lately to really notice how they talk and how they move on and how they repeat stuff. And I always appreciate when someone is really drilling a point that they think is valuable, and that's what I'm trying to do here. And so, yeah, I'm just trying to make sure that I make everything clear and easy to digest. I've moved on to the fur patterns of the arm, and because his arm is twisted, the back of his arm is facing towards his hip, I have the brown stripe on the back of his arm also twisting. If you really think about the 3D shape of your character, you'll notice things like that. That can often make a really big impact if you pay attention to how this 3D shape works. If 3D shapes are a little difficult for you, practice with making a triangle into a pyramid, or a square into a cube, or a circle into a sphere. Practice with those simple shapes and adding shadows to them. Once that starts to make sense and you're like, okay, I get how this works, and this is kind of easy, and you can overlap them and it makes sense, then think of your normal art that same way, like I'm doing with these characters. I often think of them as a bunch of like spheres and cubes. I think of them as like geometric shapes, like, they're low polygon video game characters from a Nintendo 64. I think of them like that, and it's like, okay, gotcha. Now it's easier to think of how they move in the picture. So like this tail, it's curling behind him, so I'm making sure all of my brush strokes curl in the same direction. And all the little triangle points of that fur, I'm keeping them in the same direction as the fluff, the edges of my line art, so that it creates the illusion of fluffy fur. If you need extra examples of how fur works, I always suggest pulling up photos that show you how fur and fur patterns flow along a body. This works actually just with anything. If you're needing to know what the texture looks like on tile or on concrete or leaves, grass, someone's hair, anything, look up a photo and notice how real life works. Because even with stylized, cartoony art like this, it's still imitating real life. And it's then up to each of us artists to, we cheat. We then do our own thing with it. We decide, okay, I want the lines to be kind of sharp, or I want to make everything kind of bright and bold. You cheat in the way that you want it to be, but it is still loosely based off of real life. So I think it's really, really crucial to find some photos or examples that show you how it works if you're having any trouble. You're never, quote-unquote, too good for pulling up some photo reference. Photo reference is always useful. Back to the coloring. I'm coloring in those paw pads. I'm correcting little mistakes as I see them. But I don't dwell on it. I still go back to finishing the coloring and doing other stuff because, again, I'm working on how quickly can I get this done so that I feel comfortable. Like, okay, I've quickly gotten all of the colors down. Then I'll go back for another 30-45 minutes and clean up all the edges. It's all about how much progress can you make in that amount of time. So, yeah, like right there, I apparently turned off the selection tool and all of the white on that tail went outside the lines. It wasn't hard to go ahead and erase it, like I used to do back in the day, but normally the selection tool is supposed to prevent that. So, you got to see a little bit of both in this picture, in this video. Adding the last little bit of white on that tail behind him, and this picture is about done. Adding a little more white on the paws, in that specific pattern, where only the fingers are white, but the back of the hand is still kind of that gold. But yeah, I have finished up most of the colors there, and I've shown you the basics of how I do flat colors on a character in a short amount of time to still look really good. And later on, you could add complicated colors, you could do a lot of fancy shading if you wanted, There's a lot of ways I could add to this, but because it's a character sheet, you need to keep things simple, so I kept it to just these flat colors, trying to imitate the texture while avoiding any gradient. That way, any artist who needs to use this character sheet can easily look at the colors and where the colors are, and color pick it if they choose to. So yeah, I believe that is it for this character sheet. I am now going to move on to the background in the next episode. So I guess I lied. I'm not completely done. You get to see the background, but I finished all these characters, flat colors, and the line art. And I'm excited to show you what the background's going to look like. I had a lot of fun with it. As I'm talking right now, I have finished the whole commission, but I recorded all of it and I have it saved to show you later. I'll be doing commentary when I have time. But here is a close-up of the flat colors you saw me do. I added a pattern of the bandana now as a American flag because that's what Chad said he wanted, so I thought I'd do it. And I like it. It looks good. It matches his colors. The white on that American flag isn't true white because I'm trying to keep it faded and smooth. But there you have it. I've shown you everything I can think of for now. Later on I'll probably give you more advice on coloring techniques, but that should be it for this episode. I hope you all enjoyed it. I really appreciate all the feedback you guys give me. Let me know if you have any other ideas or suggestions, anything you'd like me to cover in future episodes. Next episode will be episode 4, doing the background of this character sheet. I hope you all enjoyed this. Let me know what you think in the comments below. And next episode will be episode 4. Thank you all for watching this episode of Drawing Sessions with PenMark. I am PenMark, and thank you all for watching. I'll see you next time.